move the motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition and in the names of the Leader of the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, the Greens, and I'm thankful for the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset for his support for this motion. Mr. Speaker, this is a genuinely cross-party motion, so much so that I think at least for a short while, it even appeared to have the support of one of the Conservative leadership candidates, the International Development Secretary, but I assume after a phone call from his Chief Whip that he thought better of it. Mr. Speaker, the motion before the House is a simple proposition, namely that on the 25th of June, Parliament and not the Executive shall have control of the business of the House. That would ensure that there's an opportunity for this House to bring forward a further business motion to set out at that later date a schedule for the stages of a parliamentary bill relating to our departure from the EU. Mr. Speaker, I will in a moment, but just want to set out what we're seeking to achieve. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The motion before the House does not introduce legislation today. It does not specify what form any subsequent legislation should take, and it does not prevent the Executive from seeking to pass a Brexit deal. Instead, it is a first and limited step to ensure that Parliament cannot be locked out of the Brexit process over the coming weeks and months. Mr. Speaker, it paves the way for Parliament to take further action, including to prevent no deal, should the House consider that necessary. And crucially, it means that if the next Prime Minister is foolish enough to try to pursue a no-deal Brexit without gaining the consent of this House, or to prorogue Parliament in order to force through no deal, then Parliament would have the means to prevent that. So it's a motion that empowers Parliament. I will in one moment. It will introduce a safety valve in the Brexit process, and it will be a reminder to all Conservative leadership candidates that this House will take every step necessary to prevent a no deal. I give way.
Most grateful. Will the honourable gentleman be good enough to tell us just exactly what constitutional authority he refers to when it is clear on from every single constitutional authority that has ever been written, we operate on the basis of parliamentary government, not government by Parliament. Could he cite an example of this being abrogated in any constitutional authority?
The bill we passed in March to provide for or to mandate the Prime Minister to seek an extension of Article 50. But we are in unprecedented times, and Parliament has to have the ability to speak on this issue. And when we are facing the suggestion from some of the leadership contenders that Parliament would be prorogued and shut out of the process, we are forced to take action. I will give way.
I thank my friend for giving way on that point, and is he as alarmed as I am by the cavalier way in which certain leadership contenders fighting the leadership election for the party opposite seem to think that they can cast Parliament aside to ensure that they can have their no-deal Brexit, when it's quite clear that this Parliament will not allow a no-deal Brexit to pass. And in those circumstances, isn't it absolutely the responsible and right thing to do to give this Parliament the chance to prevent shenanigans of that outrageous kind?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with every word of that intervention. I'm grateful for it. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a simple proposition, but it's also an important one, and let me just address why. Primarily, it's because after 9 years of austerity, a no-deal Brexit would make the huge social and economic challenges the country already faces much, much worse. It would, in the words, in a moment I will, it would, in the words of the manufacturing organisation Make UK, be an act of economic lunacy. To quote the CPI, it would take a sledgehammer to the economy, or Toyota, who have said that no deal is terrible and will create big additional challenges. Just yesterday, I was with the GMB representatives at the Ford plant in Bridgend, who were very clear about the appalling impact of no deal on jobs.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And would he agree that it's in exceptional circumstances where both the Trade Union Congress and the CBI are saying exactly the same thing, that no deal is utterly reckless and irresponsible?
That's right.
I hope it's not the only time that the CBI and the TUC say the same thing, but they very obviously do on this issue. I'll take an intervention here and then I'll take an intervention there.
Thank you. We've spent many hours in this chamber debating the government taking Henry VIII powers. Now we're seeing Tory leadership candidates try and take Charles I action.
Exactly.
Aren't we seeing an internal conflict within the Conservative Party create a constitutional crisis in this country? Doesn't the Secretary agree with me?
Well, it didn't end well for Charles I, but it is a very serious position that we find ourselves in when, having been through the best part of 3 years debate and argument about Brexit, there's a suggestion that Parliament should be shut out of the process with no further business until November. That is completely unacceptable. I'll take the intervention here.
I thank him for giving way. He's very generous. Would he agree with me that there are some highly irresponsible Tory leadership contenders who are traipsing around the country advocating no deal, when, of course, before the referendum, the sort of things they were saying was, for instance, it's in our mutual self-interest suggests that we would cut a very good deal, or that a free trade agreement continues to give access to UK goods and services on the European continent, and many other examples where those very same candidates prior to the referendum were offering the best deal possible. Now they seem to be advocating crashing out, which is something that wouldn't affect them personally financially, I'm sure, but would many of their constituents.
Well, I agree with that intervention. I'm grateful for it. And this translation, or attempted translation, of the vote to leave into a vote for no deal is to misrepresent the arguments and what was actually said at the referendum. I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. The Honourable Member for Stone asked us to contemplate where a Parliament helps to set the business of that Parliament rather than just the government. Of course, it doesn't have to look too far to Holyrood, where business is set by a committee of the House. And when we're discussing an issue as grave as a no-deal Brexit, would it not be an abdication, gross abdication, of all our responsibilities if Parliament did not act to stop this government from pursuing such a ridiculous policy?
Well, I agree it would be an abdication not to support this motion and to give this foothold to Parliament to actually have proper involvement in what happens next. I'll give way one more time and then I'll make progress.
I'm very grateful indeed. Some Conservative leadership contenders, of course, are in favour of no deal. Others, such as the former Foreign Secretary this morning, seems to be hedging his bets, not even clear if he's clear or not, as it were. Does the right honourable gentleman agree with me that there is no such thing as a clean and simple no deal, and neither is there such a thing as a managed no deal, no more than a fall from a high building is managed until you hit the ground?
There's no such thing as a managed no deal. No deal would be chaotic and highly disruptive or for the economy, as I've already set out, but also, Mr. Speaker, in other areas. I was Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years. I worked in Europol and Eurojust, and I worked with the security services day in, day out. I know all too well that no deal would cause immense disruption to judicial cooperation and joint criminal investigations going on at the moment, and throw a wrench into vital arrangements on extradition and shared databases. And I know the Secretary of State shares my concern about these issues. No deal would make us less safe. Mr. Speaker, I think ultimately that is why the current Prime Minister, who I knew when she was Home Secretary and worked with her, came to realise that no deal was never a credible policy. She did at one stage say that no deal should be the default and that it was her deal or no deal, but towards the end she recognised it wasn't credible for a number of reasons, but I think ultimately it was because of the impact or likely impact on national security and counter-terrorism provisions. And these are not light issues for us to brush aside and not even have a voice on if we were to go down this route. And then, I'll give way in just a minute. And then there's Ireland. The UK has a solemn vow to protect the Good Friday Agreement and avoid a hard border in all circumstances. It's one of the most important treaties this country has ever entered into, and it's one we cannot break or undermine. And we should be clear that a no-deal Brexit risks that. And I know how concerned communities are on both sides of the border about this. So, Mr. Speaker, the motion before the House is simple and important. It's also necessary. Over recent weeks, we've witnessed the Conservative leadership contest descend into the disturbing, the ludicrous and the reckless. It's become an arms race to promise the most damaging form of Brexit, or to make the most absurd and undeliverable promises. No wonder the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip is the front-runner against that criteria. But not to be outdone, the Honourable Member for Esher and Walton, who I shadowed for a short time when he was Brexit Secretary, has told us that he is so committed to protecting democracy that he's willing to close down Parliament in order to force through. And that's how strong his commitment is to democracy. I will give way, and then I will. Yeah.
What is his assessment of the likely reaction in the palace were an unelected new Prime Minister with no mandate to close down Parliament when Parliament had voted time and time again overwhelmingly against no deal?
I don't know, and I hope that never has to be tested. I will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Does he share my anger and frustration at the way in which those words around taking back control have now been cynically kind of reinterpreted to mean actually a reckless new Tory Prime Minister taking all of the control to themselves and certainly not sharing control with the people, and much less their parliamentary representatives?
Absolutely.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Mr. Gareth Snell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologise for interrupting the flow of debate, but under my understanding, the motion in front of us is about the business of the House on the 25th of June, and we seem to be having a far-ranging debate on the merits or not of a no-deal Brexit and the outcome of a Conservative leadership election. Have I missed some additional paperwork on this matter, Mr. Speaker, or is this now a debate on the principles of no deal, which I absolutely don't support?
No, the honourable gentleman is a perceptive denizen of the House. He has not missed any relevant paperwork, and he is right about the procedural character of the motion. There is a degree of latitude as the background to the debate, the context in which it's taking place, are aired. But I'm sure that ere long, colleagues will wish to focus on the procedural specificity of the motion, both for their own sakes and possibly also to satisfy the parliamentary palate of the honourable gentleman. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I was about to respond to the intervention. I do think it's fundamental that we deal with the argument that it's proper in any way to close down Parliament at such a critical stage of the exercise. The idea of Parliament not sitting and not having business until November is unthinkable, and we have to take action to prevent that happening. Now, that is what I double-took when the Honourable Member from Esher and Walton said that and wanted to check that that is actually what he said, but of course it is. My office did try to read more about the former Brexit Secretary's plan on his campaign website. However, they were met with this rather ominous message yesterday, quotes, "Access to DominicRaab2019.com is denied because it belongs to a category that we block to protect customers using the parliamentary network." Quite right too. I will take the intervention.
I thank the Shadow Secretary. I always knew the parliamentary ICT people would get it right in the end. Now, after a few weeks respite from this, we do seem to be back, but I'm not sure we've actually moved on. So with respect to leaving the EU and the business of the House, people have said that this House has expressed a view that we do not want to leave with no deal. But there's only two ways that this House can do that. Either it can revoke Article 50, or it can vote for a deal. Now, it has done neither. Now, which does the Shadow Secretary of State and the opposition front bench choose? Revoke? Or does it choose a deal? And when is it going to decide?
Mr. Speaker, I just want to be clear about what today is about. It's not about the substance, because it's the business of the House, so that the House can decide the House can decide what to do next. The House can only move forward with a majority, but if there is a majority, against no deal, and I believe there is, that majority needs to be heard now more than ever, and that is all that this motion is about. The alternative is simply to say it's perfectly acceptable for an incoming Prime Minister to push Parliament to one side at the most critical stage of the exercise and say it doesn't matter if Parliament doesn't want no deal. I'm not going to listen to them. In fact, I'm not going to even let them sit. I'm going to make some progress. Mr. Speaker, this is a serious point, because the Tory leadership race is now increasingly offering, as the Leader of the Opposition has said, a choice between no deal, and no deal. Candidates are openly threatening to sideline or silence this House on an issue that would affect all of our lives and the fabric of this country for a generation. That is reckless, and it cannot be allowed to stand. Mr. Speaker, we may be using a novel parliamentary mechanism today. I accept that, but it's not the first time that I've had to make that kind of argument from this dispatch box. Time and time I've stood here saying that Parliament must have a meaningful role in the process. There was near consensus when it got to the cross-party talks in April of this year that they should have happened 2 years before. This pushing away of Parliament has been a huge part of the problem. The Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, fought against us far too often, but every time this House fought back. Now we must focus on the next fight. We face the very real challenge that the next Prime Minister will force through a no-deal Brexit without the consent of this House or the British people. I'll take both interventions.
Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? I know there's a great deal of fear that the successful Tory candidate may be somebody who wants a no deal, but it could also be somebody who wants to try and secure a deal. And so would it be the Labour Party's position that if that was the case, that we would enter back into negotiations to try and get an agreement this House can support?
I'm grateful for that intervention. As I made clear at the outset, this motion does not prevent a deal being passed by this House. It simply allows Parliament to have a say, to have a foothold in the event that an incoming Prime Minister does try to force through no deal or tries to shut Parliament out altogether. I'll take the intervention across.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, but in returning to the substance of this debate, does he accept that if government can't control its own business in this place, then we risk actually ignoring the wishes of the electorate when it comes to elections? When we come to elections, and election manifesto promises will turn to dust if this sort of thing is allowed to continue.
If the government can't control the business of the House, the government should go.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's giving an excellent defence of parliamentary democracy. The opposite side are trying to derive legitimacy from a very narrow and contentious referendum result that under no circumstances specified that no deal carried a majority support in this country. Isn't it the case that actually in this action Parliament is standing up for the will of the people by majority in this country?
Before he moves on, well, why don't I take a double intervention?
Well, we've heard a lot about parliamentary democracy, even in the short time we've been having this debate. But this is surely about parliamentary sovereignty, our right to have a voice, and have a voice on all the great issues of state.
Absolutely, on both interventions. I will give way in just 1 second. That's why I started by saying this is a very, very simple proposition and simple motion that simply says Parliament should not be shut out of the decision on no deal or shut out of the process altogether. And I can't think why any parliamentarian would vote against that proposition. I genuinely cannot. I will give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, but is it not that we're also facing this ludicrous narrative that there is the possibility to walk away from the EU with no deal, when the very first requests, if there's any attempt for a free trade deal, will be dealing with citizens, dealing with the money and dealing with the border on Ireland?
Well, I agree. The difficulty is if I was to list every ludicrous promise and statement that's been made in the leadership contest in the Conservative Party so far, this debate, would there be no other speakers in this debate? There is this ludicrous concept that the EU's always been willing to ditch the backstop, and it only takes the likes of some of the contenders to go and ask for it, and it'll all happen. I don't know a great deal about the details of the current Prime Minister's negotiating strategy, but I do know this, that had it been possible to get an alternative to the backstop, the current Prime Minister would have sought to secure it. That's what she was trying to do. And the idea that by changing the Prime Minister, somebody else could go across to Brussels and the EU will say, well, we don't bother about that anymore, that's fine, as long as you're asking for it, it'll go. It is simply ludicrous. And the promises that are being made are ludicrous, and they're going to fall apart. The EU isn't going to change its position, and this Parliament isn't going to change its position on no deal. That's why we've got to have a vote at this absolutely crucial time. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. It strikes me that there are two principles at stake today. One of them being the convention in this House for the government to be able to control the order paper. The other a constitutional principle as to whether the government can prorogue Parliament in pursuit of its policy objectives, with all that means for the Crown and the Crown's involvement in politics. I believe that the latter of those two principles is the weightier one and the one that we should be bearing in mind as we vote today.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and the prerogative powers always have to be seen and analysed in their political and historic context, and they always have been. Prerogative powers, as the House knows, have changed over time, and some of them have almost disappeared completely because it's been recognised that what was a prerogative power needs to be a power that's actually vested in this House. And I think we may well be at that point in relation to this prerogative power, which needs properly to be tested, to actually push Parliament aside altogether. But the very idea of pushing Parliament aside between now and the next deadline for leaving, so that Parliament can't have a voice, even to make preparatory steps for no deal, it only needs to be set out to be shown to be so undemocratic. So this is about a safety valve. It's about providing certainty. It's about actually empowering this House, and I'd urge all MPs to back it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. I call the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Oh, yes, I'm forcibly reminded of a matter. The honourable gentleman can wait just a moment, with which I ought to deal before that point. I will now announce the result of the ballot held today for the election of a new chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. 447 votes were cast with 3 spoilt ballot papers. This means 444 valid votes were cast, and the quota to be reached was therefore 223 votes. Simon Hoare was elected chair with 239 votes after one round of counting. Maria Caulfield received 146 votes and Mark Pritchard received 59 votes. Simon Hoare will take up his post immediately. I congratulate the honourable gentleman on his success. The results of the count under the alternative vote system will be made available as soon as possible in the Vote Office and published on the internet for public viewing. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary Stephen Barclay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I be the first to congratulate my honourable friend on his election to that important select committee, and particularly at an important time in the workings of that select committee. May I just begin by picking up on a few of the points that the Right Honourable and Learned gentleman made in his opening remarks. He began his first passage of his speech actually covered what the motion didn't do. He set out that it didn't cover the legislation that would be unlocked by this motion. It didn't cover the substance. It didn't cover the form. And yet so often in our exchanges across this dispatch box, he keeps telling me how much he doesn't like a blind Brexit. And yet what we have before the House is in essence a blind motion. And indeed he devoted the opening of his remarks to setting out the extent to which this is a blind motion, for it doesn't contain the detail on which the House will then decide. He also, interestingly, in the context of the Conservative leadership election, went on to point out that a new Prime Minister would be limited. They would be unable to go to Brussels and secure a change to the backstop, a change of substance. And yet his own position is that under a Labour Prime Minister, of course, a new Prime Minister will be able to go to Brussels and secure. So within the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman's own remarks, one can see the contradictions inherent within this motion. But let me deal with, just in a moment, let me deal with actually the substance, what the text of this motion says. Firstly, by looking at section 1B, which gives precedence to any motion from any individual MP over government business. And then in 1C, for you, Mr. Speaker, to decide whether that motion is brought before the House over other motions. So in essence, what 1B and 1C is saying is one individual MP, together with the Speaker, two members of this House, can override the government business that comes before this House. And that is the effect of this motion. It is putting in the hands of just two members of Parliament the precedence on what business comes before the House. That is what the text, of course I give way, that is what the text of 1B and 1C says.
Grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. When the new Prime Minister does head off to Brussels, the current Prime Minister has got stuck on the triangle between the Brexit the party opposite wants, the constitutional make-up of the United Kingdom and the successor to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and all it contains. She has not been able to sort that triangle out. The new Prime Minister, when he goes to Brussels, what would be the most important? The Brexit he is promising the Tory party, the constitutional make-up of the United Kingdom, or the legacy from the Good Friday Belfast Agreement? Yeah.
So, well, firstly, the Honourable Lady says he. There are a number of female candidates in that leadership election, and one shouldn't preempt that discussion. Secondly, we don't know who that Prime Minister will be. And thirdly, let me firstly deal with actually the text. I'll happily come on to it, but I thought we are here, as per not just the direction of the Speaker, but also from the intervention for the member for Stoke Central, to actually debate the motion that is before the House. The Honourable Lady May Chunter, she may not want to debate the motion. I'm not surprised she doesn't want to debate the motion. It's a flawed motion for reasons I will come on to. But they don't want to actually debate the text that is before the House. But of course I give way to the member for Chester.
Most grateful.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, I've been in this House a hell of a long time, as most people know. But they always say that, don't they? But the fact is, I have no idea what the Secretary of State is talking about when he mentions a blind motion. Could the Speaker tell us what he's talking about when he talks about a blind motion?
Well, I don't think that what I would call motion exegesis is a matter for the Chair. I think it is for the Secretary of State to explain the terms of his motion. I am saddened if the Honourable Gentleman is befuddled, and I wouldn't want him to remain in a state of nescience for any length of time. So I hope the Secretary of State will elaborate, and then clarity will descend upon the Honourable Gentleman and all the people of Huddersfield. Secretary of State.
Yeah, I'll happily do. And the Honourable Gentleman is right. He has been in the House a long time, so long that he was actually Eurosceptic when he arrived. But let me, and there is still time. There is still time. But let me return to the Opposition Day text that is before the House, and the effect of it is to give virtually unlimited scope. Because it deals with the business in relation to the EU's withdrawal from the EU. Well, almost all aspects of our national life fall within that scope. So you have the potential for a motion brought forward by an individual member, determined in terms of precedence just by the Speaker, on a scope that is virtually unlimited. Of course I do.
Right honourable friend, if recent election results showed anything, it's the complete frustration of the British people with a failure to solve Brexit, and a complete frustration with members of this House constantly saying what they don't support and don't believe in. In listening to the 30 minutes, respectively, of the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite, did he hear anything from him, or can he see anything in this motion which remotely gives a positive or constructive solution or way forward to the problem with the Brexit impasse, rather than just more of what they don't want?
Well, Fred is absolutely right, because what we hear repeatedly from the benches opposite is what they are opposed to. but not what they are for. And that is, in fact, reflected in the fact that the European Union, well, the Shadow International Secretary, I will to the Father of the House in a moment, but the Shadow International Secretary, again, chances. The European Union has been consistent in saying that, in their view, the withdrawal agreement is the only offer on the table, but the benches opposite voted against the withdrawal agreement, just as they voted against the deal each time. And yet their manifesto says they'll respect the result, and yet many on the benches opposite actually want a second referendum, which is clearly at odds with their manifesto. Of course, I give way to the Father of the House.
I entirely understand, and I appreciate my right honourable friend's tactics in trying to address, as he was, procedural and textual points in the motion, rather than addressing what is actually the main point, which is rather difficult for the government. I don't think these procedural and textual points would be raised if by any sad chance we were sitting on the opposition benches and we were telling a government we were opposing that the House as a whole wanted to actually have a debate and legislation on a particular issue. But will he move to the main point? Is he actually prepared to defend a situation where a new Prime Minister wishes to pursue a policy which he or she knows there is no majority for in the House of Commons? Does he believe it should be possible for that Prime Minister to prorogue and send away Parliament until he or she has exercised dictatorial powers to put the policy in place? That, I think, is plainly totally contrary to our Constitution. I don't see how any parliamentarian could possibly defend such a possibility which is before us.
Well, firstly, to the Father of the House, I absolutely share his belief, and I think the majority of members of this House share the belief that anything that brings Her Majesty into the politics of the House is to be avoided, and that has been the position I have consistently stated. But can I pick up on the specifics? Because he said, and I always listen to the Father of the House very closely, he said to not concentrate, and I quote him, on the procedural and textual parts of the issue before the House and to focus on the substance. And yet the shadow spokesperson, Brexit Secretary, in his remarks said the exact opposite. He said that he didn't want to get onto the substance because that wasn't in the text. So we have people supporting this on the one hand saying one should look at the specifics put forward by the opposition. I don't support, as I say, bringing Her Majesty. I've answered that question, but what I'm saying is there is an incoherence between people putting forward support for this before the House on the one hand and saying, but don't actually look at the substance, and then on the other hand saying what the House should consider is the substance. Of course I give way to the...
I think the Secretary of State is absolutely right to focus on the procedural nature of this, simply because there are 10 leadership candidates. They have not been whittled down, and yet this is an attempt to preserve, by potentially one member, to preserve a slot just in case that there is not an appetite for whoever may lead the Conservative Party. This is a premature business of the House. There is no need to secure the 25th of June when we have absolutely no idea who will be our next leader, and therefore this should be made to wait until that decision is made.
Yeah, Right Honourable Friend is absolutely correct in the way she puts the point. And let me give an example. So this House has a number of senior members across parties on the Procedure Committee. And yet, this proposal has not even had cursory consultation with the Procedure Committee of this job, whose job it is to advise the House on changes to procedure. Now, what is the procedure? Of course, in a moment. I'll just make a lid on and then I'll come to the Right Honourable Lady. What is the purpose, Mr. Speaker, of having a select committee to look at procedures of this House if it is not consulted on something so fundamental as a change of this nature? Of course I go away to the Right Honourable Lady.
Can he be very clear? Is he saying on behalf of the government, Her Majesty's government, that they accept and agree that a new Prime Minister could prorogue Parliament deliberately in the face of this place persistently voting against leaving without a deal, proroguing Parliament specifically to impact to impose that very no deal without any say, anything to do with this Parliament? Yes or no?
What I am saying to the Right Honourable Lady is I speak as a Minister on behalf of this government, and this Prime Minister has made her position clear in terms of where she and the Cabinet stand on the issue of prorogation. And that is a clear position that the Prime Minister has set out. I also set out, I think, the risk of any deviation from that, because I think there is a consensus across the House in terms of avoiding any suggestion of bringing Her Majesty into something that is a royal prerogative issue. But I can understand, incidentally, there's no mention in the Opposition Day debate, there's no mention of the word prorogation. It's not even mentioned in the text. So we have a change, a fundamental change to take out. They don't want to, Mr. Speaker, actually deal with the issue on which the House is voting on. I will in a moment, but she doesn't want to deal with the issue that the House is voting on, which is what is in the Opposition Day motion, and it is to take over the order paper, a fundamental change, and those on the opposite benches who look to be in government in the future will need to reflect on this. It is a fundamental change to the way this House operates without any consultation with the Procedure Committee, and in essence, if people want to support that, then what is the purpose of the Procedure Committee? Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State, who I know has never been a member of the Procedure Committee. Could I point out to him that it is not the role of the Procedure Committee to pre-vet motions that are put before this House, either opposition motions or government motions? And can he come back to the central point? How would he feel if somebody was proposing to prorogue this House in order to avoid the House having a voice on something where he was in the majority, whereas on this he's in the minority? Hear, hear, hear.
What I was addressing was firstly speaking on behalf of this government. I don't know who the next Prime Minister is and what decisions they were taken. I've set out the view in terms of what the risks are of any deviation, and Mr. Speaker has made very clear in terms of the way that he would represent the will of the House, that there are a number of ways, and I think indeed in the exchange he had with the Honourable Lady in respect of SO24, there was an exchange perhaps pertaining, I wouldn't want to interpret that judgment from the Chair, but I think the Honourable Lady knows full well in the exchange related to Standing Order 24, the response from the Chair, which I think is germane to the issue on which any attempt at prorogation would open up a potential SO24. So I think this is here. But let me come on to not, because obviously the Honourable Lady has not wanted to deal with the actual text before the House, but let me look at what constitutional experts have said around this issue. People such as Philip Cowley, Professor at Queen Mary School of Politics, who, when talking about the order paper being taken over outside of the control of the government, he said, and I quote, "It would be one of the most fundamental shifts in our relationship between the government and Parliament." Well, indeed. I come to the Honourable Lady, my right honourable friend, in a moment. Again, they chunter from the bench opposite that we have already done this. They have already done this. Yes, so shall we look at how effective that was? Because when it was done previously, when it was done by, and I don't think she's in her place, but the member, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Pontefract, Normanton and Castleford, it was justified on the basis of her concern at the imminent risk of no deal. That's why the constitutional advice from people such as Philip Cowley, from people such as Vernon Bogdaner, Professor of King's College London, who warned about the actions at the time, who said that it would be unconstitutional, the reason those issues were overrode was because we were told that the risk of no deal merited that emergency legislation. In a moment, I come to my own. But let me just finish this point, and then I will take some further interventions. So we were told this constitutional change was required without the Procedure Committee, without due diligence, without proper consultation, passed in haste in a day, on the basis that it was to prevent no deal. But let's look at what then happened in the House of Lords. Because Lord Panic...
Anna Soubry.
Speaker, I and many others are concerned about the time. This matter's been listed for an hour. So far, the front bench contributions have taken up 40 minutes of the allotted 60 minutes. Some of us would wish to speak, but in any event, we all agree this is an important motion properly tabled by Her Majesty's opposition, worthy of debate. So, Mr. Speaker, can you assist us all as to the likely length of this important debate, please?
Well, I don't want to state now an expected length, but what I would say is that the observation about an hour is something that may have got abroad in recent times, but it is mere surmise. This debate could run until 8:33, which I'm sure will be more than adequate time for the Honourable Lady to make her contribution. Right, Honourable Lady, to make her contribution. I'm not suggesting that it will run anything like that time, but she shouldn't be overly preoccupied with the idea that it will run only for an hour, and therefore the House will be deprived of the opportunity both of the intellectual rigour of her prospective contribution and of the mellifluous tones that she would wish to bring to bear. There is every prospect that several people will be heard. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, well, of course, if I wasn't taking so many interventions, I would conclude my remarks with more alacrity, but I will take the request from the Honourable Lady. But if I can just finish the point, I did promise one further intervention to my right honourable friend. We were told last time that this had to be passed in a day, in a manner that was unprecedented, to stop no deal, and yet Lord Panic, when debating the EU Withdrawal Act No. 5 2019, said in his reports, the restrictions on the Prime Minister's powers may cause a no-deal exit. In fact, that was the premise for Lord Panic and a number of amendments that were made in the upper house. So the ultimate irony, Mr. Speaker, is firstly, we have a situation where emergency legislation passed in haste had the opposite effect of what was intended. And then secondly, we're told that in order to stop something unconstitutional, that we need to embrace a parliamentary procedure that the constitutional experts say is unconstitutional.
Right, the friend for giving way. In support of his case, can I just return him to the question I posed to the shadow spokesman, and which we didn't really get an answer. In fact, the only answer was, if the government can't control its business, then it should step down. And I'd ask one or two of our own colleagues on our own side who are thinking of supporting this motion today to reflect on that answer. But can I ask him, try to get an answer out of him that we couldn't get out of the opposition, that is, if we go down this road, doesn't it set a dangerous precedent? Because the whole purpose of the government controlling the business of the House is that they can honour election manifesto promises. And if we can't do that, then they turn to dust.
Yeah, honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think if I can pray in aid in addressing his point, indeed the remarks of the right honourable member, the member for West Dorset, because when the previous emergency legislation was passed, it was on the basis, and I quote, and I always listen intently because he's a very experienced senior member of this House, and he said at the time, quotes, "We have been driven to this only in an extreme emergency." And this really relates to the timing of this, because my right honourable friend is backing a candidate to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Well, it's rather difficult, I would suggest, to say there is an extreme emergency if the next Prime Minister is the candidate who he supports. So the issue really is the timing of this and whether indeed it is an emergency. I'll take one last intervention, and then, conscious of the stricture from the opposition bench, I'll conclude. I'll take one further intervention.
For giving way. Does he not accept that part of the public anger and frustration with Parliament is, notwithstanding the back and forward contributions that are made, or even individual contributions that are made, but it's been a plague on all of our houses, the way we've not been able to reconcile this? What message does it send out if the power grab means that parliamentarians who are sent here to make decisions are instead sent home and excluded.
The honourable gentleman, I have voted for the withdrawal route 3 times. He hasn't, and that is why the frustration is. But that is not the primary issue before the House today. And really the issue was captured last time when this was debated by the honourable gentleman, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, when he said, if he doesn't mind me quoting him, if we as a House are going to be asked to hand over day after day, we should know what we will be asked to vote on during those days. And it's the nature of what the House is being asked to support today that is the issue. It is the concentration of control in a motion from an individual and the Speaker together. It is the fact that the scope of that is potentially so widespread. It is the fact it is at odds with the manifestos on which both front benches stood. It is, in essence, because it is an attempt to circumvent some of the internal tension within the party opposite, which is best played out at their next conference rather than through a decision of this House. And I agree with my right honourable friend, for my own colleagues, we heard from the right honourable and learned gentleman what this is really about. It is to say the government cannot control the order paper and therefore it is a way to get rid of the government. And I ask my colleagues to be mindful of that when they cast their vote.
Thank you. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak this afternoon for Scotland's National Party in this debate. Can I congratulate and thank the official opposition for giving us this opportunity and welcome the cross-party consensus that has seen, to my reckoning, every party bar one represented on the list of signatories for this motion. Can I congratulate the Secretary of State, because I've always admired his ability in best debating society style to speak at great length without hesitation and without repetition. But this afternoon he managed to add the achievement of not actually saying anything during the time that he was on his feet. We'll get the cries of democratic and constitutional outrage. The very idea that Parliament should decide what Parliament is going to discuss in the future. As my honourable friend pointed out, there are very successful, very highly regarded parliaments not too far from this one, where Parliament sets the business, and that seems to work perfectly well. The constitutional experts say it's a bad idea. I wonder what the predecessors of those same constitutional experts thought of the ridiculous notion that women should be allowed to vote and women should be allowed to sit in this Parliament. No doubt they were telling us that was a dangerous precedent as well. I'll happily give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he agree with me that the Secretary of State appeared to be telling us that he agreed that it would be wrong to drag the Crown into Parliament by having a prorogation which was as political as that suggested by some of the Tory leadership candidates? And therefore, does he agree with me that passing this resolution merely puts into our standing orders for that particular date an insurance policy to prevent the more unscrupulous of those who are currently standing for the Tory leadership to do precisely what they're threatening to do in those hustings?
The honourable lady makes a very valid point. I think the more important point is that this motion wants, on one particular day in 2 weeks' time, the elected members of this Parliament to decide what we're going to discuss. And the Secretary of State and others have said that it prevents the government from having their business put in order paper. The government can't tell us what they want us to be discussing on Monday, never mind 2 weeks' time. And when you look at the stuff they've been using to pad out the agenda for the last several weeks, they can hardly claim that there's a backlog of, well, there is a backlog of massively important legislation needing to come through. There's no sign whatsoever of it coming through. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, what would be a democratic and constitutional outrage. It would be an outrage for any government, either through deliberate malice or sheer incompetence, to plunge us into a disastrous no-deal Brexit, against the interests of our foreign nations, against the will of Parliament, and now, since the 23rd of May, quite clearly against the will of the people. It would be an outrage for the expressed will of 62% of the sovereign citizens of my nation to be cast aside as if we neither existed nor mattered. It would be an outrage if 3 million citizens on these islands saw their basic rights curtailed and undermined as a result of a flawed and corrupted referendum from which they were banned in participating. But, Mr Speaker, all of these would pale into nothing compared to the outrage we would see if the first act of a Prime Minister appointed in an election in which less than 1/4% of the population was allowed to take part was to abolish this Parliament and only reinstate it when it was too late for us to carry out the duty for which we were elected, the duty of pulling our four nations back from what everyone in this chamber knows would be an economic and social catastrophe.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the honourable member who asked the question earlier in terms of prorogation. The last twice it's been used constitutionally, for instance, in the Commonwealth nation of Canada, is to hide the utter incompetence of the elected government who was about to lose office. Can you remind the House again that this is a constitutional norm of this parliamentary procedure, and the only way to do it is to actually vote for the opposition's motion?
Absolutely, I agree entirely with that, and of course we are told by the Honourable Lady opposite that this is premature. I wonder if you could tell us which future allocated opposition day should like the official opposition to bring this motion forward, given that we were told last week that they've had the fact for this session and there ain't going to be another opposition day.
I've just been asked to nominate a day. Can I ask you, Mr Speaker, given that you are always a friend of all the backbenchers, if it seems to me that there is a worry of a particular candidate that they may or may not like the order paper to be reflective of. If, Mr Speaker, there was a worry about having a choice of how we wish to leave the European Union, I'm sure, Mr Speaker, you would find yourself a way to ensure there was parliamentary time. Whereas at the moment, we don't know what it is we're voting to have the day for. It's a fear of one or two of the candidates. So therefore, Mr Speaker, if their fears were to be recognised, I'm absolutely certain you yourself would facilitate a debate.
I always seek to facilitate the House and to ensure that the full range of opinion is expressed. These are matters of debate, and notwithstanding the sedulous efforts to entice me into contributing to it, I feel I must exercise a self-denying ordinance. But the Honourable Lady has made her own point in her own way with alacrity. Mr Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll say once again, it is not premature for the opposition to have brought this forward today. This, at the moment, is the last chance that they have got, and I'm grateful, and for one, I'm very grateful that we decided to take that chance. The reason that we need to give Parliament the chance to set the agenda just once is because the government has shown no inclination whatsoever to do anything to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Why would a no-deal Brexit be so bad? Well, let's look at what some of the key drivers of the UK economy have been saying recently. Sidney Nash, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. For the automotive sector, no deal is simply not an option. Hearing politicians promote a no deal does not fill any of our companies with confidence. Our strong desire is that no deal is taken off the table. Seamus Nevin of Make UK, many members will note better in its previous name, of the Engineering Employers Federation. Our members are quite blunt. They say that a no-deal scenario would be nothing short of an act of economic vandalism. Tim Rycroft from the Food and Drink Federation. No deal is something our members are most unanimous about. 45% of our members say no deal would lead to redundancies. Nick van der Westenhals of Director of EU Exit and International Trade at the National Farmers Union. No deal would be disastrous for some sectors in agriculture. It is frankly worrying that we see it being put forward as a plausible scenario to leave without a deal in October. Mr Speaker, these are not choice quotes from selected commentators that I've picked up over the last 3 or 4 years. I will in a minute. These are not choice quotes that I've picked up over the last 3 or 4 years. These are all today in this Parliament, in evidence to the Brexit Select Committee just over 6 hours ago. That's what these major economic drivers are saying right now, and it's about time the government and some of their backbenchers are prepared to listen.
Hear, hear.
I realise that the Scottish National Party don't like to respect referendum results, either north of the border or across the UK. But when those eminent witnesses were giving that evidence to the Select Committee today, and I've heard from others about that evidence, and I share their view. I do not want a no deal. That is why I have voted for a deal 3 times. So what did the honourable gentleman say to those witnesses in response as to why he kept voting against the deal, which has put us in this position?
Wow. Well, Mr Speaker, I have enormous respect for the right honourable gentleman, the chair of the Select Committee in which I serve, and I know he would show latitude where possible, but I think it would be a bit much if members of the committee started taking questions from the evidence, as seems to be suggested. And can I say to the honourable gentleman and to some of his friends that if they want to throw out accusations about failing to respect the result of a referendum that meant Scotland has to keep sending members of Parliament to sit in the Palace of Westminster, doing it to an SNP or any Scottish MP while they're delivering a speech in the Palace of Westminster that we're only here because we do accept the result of that referendum is not the most credible time to be doing it. Mr Speaker, I've said often enough, I respect the right of the people to speak in a referendum. I also respect the right of the people to say they want another go. And I not only expect, but I demand that the result of the referendum in 2016 in my nation of sovereign citizens be respected, rather than simply laughed out of court time and time again by the party opposite. And of course, Mr Speaker, we already know from previous work done by the CBI and others, the financial cost to Scotland of a no-deal Brexit is more than the entire amount we spend every year on our precious National Health Service. Up to 100,000 people could lose their jobs, although in this place some people seem a lot more concerned about who's going to get that one job than about who's going to lose the other 100,000. Mr Speaker, there was a bit of protest from the party opposite when I said that a no-deal Brexit was against the clearly expressed will of the people, but it's true. In a democracy, one of the key ways that we find out the will of the people is through the ballot box. And for nearly 3 years, we knew that about 17.5 million people wanted to leave the EU, but none of us knew, and none of us had any right to assume what kind of Brexit those 17.5 million people wanted. And I cry shame on all those who had the arrogance to think that they knew what the 17.5 million people wanted. We still don't know what Brexit they all want, but thanks to the EU elections on the 23rd of May, we know what they don't want. Because those same people who voted in 2016 to leave the European Union decisively rejected the parties whose manifesto consisted of a no-deal Brexit. This is the first time people had ever been given the chance to turn out and vote decisively for a no-deal Brexit. And even among those that voted leave, they avoided those no-deal parties in their millions. 34%. Barely 1 in 3 of Leave voters supported the no-deal parties. Of 17.4 million people who voted Leave, 11.5 million of them refused to vote for hard no-deal Brexit parties on the 23rd of May.
Is it not also the case that the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, went to the country in March 2017 on her approach, which was towards a hard Brexit, and ended up losing her majority and with a minority government? So actually people had already expressed their will.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well said.
My honourable friend makes a very valid point. Unfortunately, on that occasion, as in too many occasions, the soon-to-be former Prime Minister was listening to nobody apart from her own reflection in the mirror. And it's not even as if the Brexit Party can claim that 11.5 million people wanted a no-deal Brexit but didn't vote for them because they disagreed with some other aspect of the Brexit Party's policies, because they haven't got any other policies for people to disagree with.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I'm sure, like me and the rest of the House, can recall the Prime Minister before the general election saying that she was being obstructed by Parliament to get her deal. That was put to the public, and as we all know, she got a result from the public, that is, she lost her majority. And in relation to one of the other points I made, like him, we have consulted employers, owners of companies and so forth. They want a deal. I'm sure he would agree with me about that.
I think if you ask a lot of these business leaders just now what would be their ideal option if they could have a completely free choice of options, most of them would say don't leave. Those who were pushing for us to accept the Prime Minister's deal previously made it perfectly clear it was because they thought it was either the Prime Minister's deal or no deal. I think if they were presented with a choice of the Prime Minister's Brexit or no Brexit, they might give a very different decision. So, Mr Speaker, the people had their choice, the chance to vote for no deal, and they chose not to. We can no longer say that pursuing or being willing to allow a no-deal Brexit is the will of the people. The people spoke on 23rd of May just as firmly and just as decisively as they did in June 2016. And those who for the last 3 years have been telling us we have to listen to what people said in June 2016, they better start listening to what people said in May 2019. Because it wasn't just the failure of the no-deal Brexit parties to get anything like a majority of support. The parties who were unambiguous in saying that they were standing in a manifesto of Stop Brexit, without exception, had record-breaking successes. The SNP had our best ever European election result, a result of which I'm proud to say that my good friend Alan Smith is now Vice President of the European Free Alliance and is likely, President of the European Free Alliance and is likely to become the Vice President of a group that's got almost 50% more MPs than the one that Mr Farage wants to lead.
Yeah.
Plaid Cymru had their best ever European elections. The Liberal Democrats had their best ever European elections. The Alliance Party in Northern Ireland had their best ever European elections. The Greens only managed their second best ever, but it's still 30 years since we were anywhere near the vote that they got this time. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the Tories went into these elections telling people in Scotland to send a message to Nicola Sturgeon. I can confidently say, Mr Speaker, Nicola Sturgeon has got the message. The purpose of today's motion is to force the government to do what any rational, sane and democracy-respecting government would already have done. We're trying to force the government to give Parliament a choice, to give direction to a government which is leaderless, rudderless, drifting and utterly lost. The motion is designed to give Parliament a chance to stop a no-deal Brexit and to stop what would effectively be a non-military coup against Parliament that some would-be Prime Ministers are already openly advocating. In January 2019 and March 2019 and April 2019, this Parliament voted to take no deal off the table. On the 23rd of May, the people made it clear that they want no deal taken off the table. This morning, some of our most important industries pleaded with us to take no deal off the table. Mr Speaker, our duty could not be clearer. Whatever our individual views on the European Union might be, it's time to get no deal off the table, and we can start that process by supporting the motion today.